Hello. Today we have the question that was posed, which was, what is the most significant event of the Absolutism era and why? First off, I want to discuss what are some of the significant events of the Absolutism era in the first place. Initially, there was a problem. There was a lot of chaos going on, a lot of civil war. People were really concerned what the direction of their state and their lives were going in. That provided the theory of absolutism, and then these rulers in England and France mainly put these into practice. What eventually came out of this practice of absolutism was a centralized state. Now they became far more centralized as a result. There's a bigger bureaucracy, but the states themselves became more efficient. More taxes were brought in, more public services were provided. Now, certainly at this period of time of the 1600s, you're not nearly going to have the public services that we see today, or certainly for the benefit of the common people. It was more seen as a benefit for the rulers themselves. So, certainly the centralized state, more taxes, more money, more direction by government was being taken around this time due to this absolutism sort of state. Now, some states were successful in actually putting forth this absolutism practice. For example, France was very successful. They did have a ruler, King Louis. He did have complete and utter control. And after his death, France basically continued on. Now, certainly towards the end of King Louis XIV's time, France was a weaker, or certainly in a weaker position, but it could recover due to the centralized state that was established during his reign. So they would be able to recover financially, militarily, and certainly population would rebound due to some of the efforts made by King Louis XIV. So it was successful in that area. In other areas like England, or what we call United Kingdom today, it wasn't nearly as successful. Oliver Cromwell, he did create a absolutist state. There was rebellion against the monarchy. That was successful. They did kick him out, but during Oliver Cromwell's time, he eventually pushed everyone out and he became the sole ruler, but not for very long, only a matter of years. And afterwards, England, the politicians, certainly the wealthy members of society, decided to go back to the way things were. And so eventually, you're going to have the call back of King Charles' son. That didn't really work out either. And so eventually they're also going to call on a distant relative, William of Orange, and then he's going to be put into place. Now, he's not going to be the sole ruler like we would see with King Louis XIV. What you're going to see is where Parliament and the monarchy share power, which lead into what will become the constitutional monarchy that England has to this day. It is going to be a process, but Absolutism era moves us forward to the constitutional monarchy that we see in England today. And much of the freedoms that the United States borrows is starting to crop up at this time as well. For example, freedom of religion is starting to take hold in England. Shared power and some political independence for many of the individuals in England is starting to crop up as well. So a huge significance of the Absolutism era is certainly the changing different ways in which politics is enacted on. A big one of the essentially effects of Absolutism era is the centralized state, but also the different directions and freedoms that are going to be provided out of this political experiment of sorts. Now, not all countries are going to really benefit from this absolutism era. For example, Russia and Prussia, they have an experiment. Prussia is a little more successful, and Russia really reverts back to the way things were before they try to grab that power. So as far as the most significant element of the absolutism era, it's certainly up to opinion. You certainly can read a lot of different topics on the absolutism era, but certainly what provoked out of this absolutism era is once again the centralized state, and that's very important as states are able to afford enact new laws, and it becomes a more stable system in Europe. Now, certainly there's a lot of warfare, and this warfare is going to spill over, and certainly in the 1600s, definitely in the 1700s, and later on, there's going to be centuries of war. But what the centralized state does is much of the funding from the military is going to derive from the society, and they're going to understand, certainly through King Louis XIV, that it can bankrupt the state. So many states, to preserve their own state, both financially, politically, and militarily, they have the system of alliances and diplomacy that start to crop up to try prevent that sort of thing from happening. So they are very careful about it. Now, there is a lot of war, but there is a balance of power motive coming out of this era as well. You would not have the centralized state and the interconnectivity that is going to be provoked out of the absolutism era at any time prior to this point. So this sort of theory and practice really starts Europe on the road to the states that we can now identify and the Europe that we know today. Of course, that's going to spill over to where they expand all over the world and really become more advanced than many of the other cultures in the world, and why they're able to take advantage of some of these cultures, certainly with colonialism, but that's a topic for another day. So some of the significant events that occurred in the Absolutism era.